We start off with a scenario. 40-year-old guy. Quiet. Suburban life. Married 15 years. 2 kids. 3.5 dogs. Everything it's standard. One day, he punches somebody at work. Because somebody makes some comment on some baseball team. Takes exception to it. Punches him in the face. 3 months later. His wife discovers he's having an affair with a 16-year-old checkout kid down at the Safeway. 3 months after that. He absconds with all the money at work. Embezzles it, disappears. And is never seen again. 3 possibilities. He's a truly deep creep. The most immature midlife crisis. He has a mutation in one gene in his head. This is exactly the profile that you get in a certain neurological disease. Where it's one gene that's out of whack. Who believes in genetic influence on sexual orientation. Who thinks it's possible for prenatal events to influence your political opinions 30 years later. There is a valid way of using biology to understand who's religious and who isn't. Believe in God. Believe in souls. Believe in evil. In free will. In evolution. A genetic influence and a basic biological difference, sex difference in level of aggression. Biological basis of sex differences in intelligence. Who thinks it's all explained by nature? By nurture? A combination of both. We start trying to find something in common with these 4 things. Having your period, a disproportionate share of female aggression comes around the times of menses. Brain tumor, amygdala, aggression, and fear. If someone get a brain tumor, you might get someone who's uncontrollably violent. A lot of junk food, Twinkie defense, the argument that his addiction to junk food caused wild fluctuations in his blood sugar levels. Anabolic steroids, uncontrolled violence because they abuse taking this stuff. All of these have been used successfully in courts of law to explain the behavior of a murderer. First key thing. Sometimes the stuff what's going on in your body, can dramatically influence what goes on in your brain. Second key thing. Sometimes what's going on in your head, will affect every single outpost in your body. The interconnections between your physiology and your behavior. The underlying emotions, thoughts, memories. And the capacity for each, to deeply influence the other, under all sorts of circumstances. Categories. In the right areas. We have categories that we impose on things that are not categorical. You take a continuum, and you break it into boundaries. Because it makes it easier to store the information away. Instead of remembering the absolute features of something. Taking a continuum, and you break it into pieces, because it's easier to deal with the facts. But there's a bunch of problems with categorical thinking. Because of the differences in language. Because different languages draw boundaries at different points, as to what counts as similar or different sounds. That will affect your ability to remember stuff. What word it was. Depending on whether if it's on a different boundary, or a different sounds. E.g. in Finland they don't differentiate between the B and the P. So, at some point, a Finnish guy told me that I needed to make a practice on a bear. I thought he was kidding. And he said, yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but you need to either make a practice on a bear or an apple. Here we see the dangers of making mistakes about differences between B and P. Which means, when you're paying too much attention to categories. You can't differentiate 2 facts that fall within the same category. Another example. On a test, there was a world of difference between getting a 65 and a 66. Not particularly different. But because there's this boundary between passing and failing. There's this dramatic differentiation, when you put up boundaries. You have trouble seeing how similar things are, on either side of it. Another problem that you get when you think categorically. When you pay too much attention to boundaries. You don't see the big picture, all you see are categories. Problems. When you think in categories. 1. You underestimate how different 2 facts are when they fall in the same category. 2. Or, you overestimate how different they are, when there happens to be a boundary in between them. 3. Or, you don't see big pictures. So, we are gonna think about this big picture. And the complex issue of biology of behavior, without falling into thinking in categories. For each behavioral category. We will start off by looking at what the behavior looks like. Because it takes a lot of objectivity. Then, what went on in that organism a half second before that behavior occurred, to cause it to occur. The world of neurons. Circuitry. And where's the explanation for the behavior? This behavior happened because this part of the brain got activated. What smell, sound, sensory stimulation in the environment caused those neurons to get activated and produce that behavior? What do hormone levels, various hormones in the bloodstream of that animal, occurred at the past few hours? How do those hormones change how sensitive you are to those sounds, smells, that cause those neurons to get activated and produce the behavior? All the way through early development, Fetal life, genetic makeup of an individual, genetic makeup of the entire population, species. The evolutionary pressure on. And how you explain each one of these behaviors in the context of those outposts. And how are they not really outposts? All they are different ways of expressing the same biological influences. E.g., this hormone explains this behavior. This behavior is caused by hormone X. Hormone X is coded by a gene, nor only endocrinology, also genetics. Gene equals its subject to selection, evolution. Smells, sound, fetal development, that determined how sensitive those systems were to those sorts of stimuli. The bucket, the most convenient way of describing all the influences that came beforehand. So, there's no buckets. All they are temporary platforms. Which is the easiest way of describing the outcome of everything that came beforehand. Starting back in evolution. So that's all we're gonna do. Quotes of people that don't understand this. Give me a child at birth from any background, and let me control the total environment in which he is raised, and I will turn him into anything I wish him to be, whether doctor, lawyer, beggar or thief. John Watson, founder of behaviorism with B.F. Skinner, if you can control the rewards, punishment, positive, negative reinforcements, you could turn anybody into anything you want, whether doctor, lawyer, beggar or thief. And we know that isn't the case. We know that all you have to do, is throw in one other factor like a lot of protein malnutrition during fetal life. And you're not going to be able to do that. So, you cannot have all the control over the environment and turn somebody into whatever you want. Behavior can't be solely explained by understanding reward and punishment. Interest fact. J. Watson, shortly after that, he was driven out of academia for a wild scandal. And spent the rest of his career as an extremely successful advertising executive. Normal psychic life, depends upon the good functioning of brain synapses, and mental disorders appear as a result of the synaptic derangements. Synaptic adjustments will then modify the corresponding ideas and force them into different channels. Using this approach, we obtained cures and improvements, but no failures. Synapses, their ways brain cells connect with each other. Synaptic adjustments, frontal lobotomies. All by Igos Moniz, neurologist, who invented frontal lobotomies. That was done to 1,000 of people. Who had absolutely nothing wrong with them. One of the darkest chapters of where psychiatry gets in bed with ideology. It was a massive criminal destruction of people's brains. That quote, was what he said about the procedure, on his acceptance of his Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. Here we have, somebody pathologically living in a world, of understand how synapses are working. Adjust them, and then, we obtain cures and improvements with no failure. The selection for social utility must be accomplished by some social institution if mankind is not to be ruined by domestication-induced degeneracy. The racial ideas as the basis of our state has already accomplished as much in this respect. We may, and we must, rely on the healthy instincts of the best of our people for the extermination of elements of the population loaded with dregs. Konrad Lorenz, father of ethology. He discovered, imprinting in birds. And also happened to be a bad Nazi propagandist. Who went to his grave saying that there was nothing wrong with what he did. All three were among the most influential scientists of the last century. Influenced how people were educated, and when we decided it wasn't worth the effort of doing it. Whose influence led to the brains being destroyed of thousands of people who had nothing wrong with them. These are the people who led to the notion, that you fix up a problem, that doesn't exist, by exterminating 9 million people. So, our goal is going to not fall for that buckets. To think about human behaviors. Some of the most disturbed, frightening, and damaged human behaviors. And resist the temptation to think inside a bucket and find the explanation. Genes, hormones, neurons, environmental influence. That point will simply be the easiest way of describing all of the influences that came before. There's no buckets. 3 intellectual challenges. 1. Recognizing circumstances where there's nothing fancy about us whatsoever, we're just like every other animal out there, where the challenge is to accept that. E.g. You're a female hamster. You're in a cage. You ovulate every 5 days or so. You're in your business. But then, someone puts another female hamster in your cage. Now, both of you will being to lengthen your cycles. And eventually synchronize them. So, both are ovulating the same afternoon on a regular basis. All it is done with olfaction, pheromones, chemical airborne signals, from one female to another. And you can prove this by electrically recording from olfactory systems. Or take a paper clip over the female hamster's nose. Then, she doesn't synchronize. It's all done with olfaction. Most amazing. Put the 2 females together. And there's a way of disrupting it. Put a male hamster in there. And suddenly the cycles desynchronize and shorten. You break it up with male pheromones. And more interesting, if you put the two females together, it's not random who synchronizes the other one. The dominant female synchronizes the subordinate one. And it works this way in goats, sheep, dogs, cats, and pigs. But most remarkably, it works exactly the same way in us, humans. Wellesley effect in 1970. Over the course of freshman year, women, freshman year roommates, tended to lengthen and synchronize their cycles. Done with olfaction. Women who had olfactory deficits didn't synchronize. They would synchronize, unless they had intimate relationships with a male, in which case they desynchronized. And it's not random who synchronizes to who. The individual who's more socially outgoing, extroverted, dominating, is the one who synchronized the other one. We're all the same. Is nothing fancy about us? Well, look at comparisons between the human and the chimp genome. And it's virtually the same. Two circumstances where we appear to be just like everyone else, all the other organisms out there, but we do something very different with the similarity. E.g., two humans going through a ritual. Sitting at a table, silence, no eye contact. And they do nothing more physically taxing. Then every now and then, one of them picks up their hand and moves a little piece of wood on the table. This are two individuals playing a chess GM tournament. Both are maintaining blood pressure for 6 hours running that you only see in a marathon runner. They go through thousands of calories a day, doing nothing more than thinking. And you look at the GM, they will have the same physiology as some male baboon on the savannah who's ripped the stomach open of his worst rival. And we're doing it there, just with thought. Also, we have typical, boring physiology. But we use it in ways that no other animal could. We get stressed by the inevitability of our mortality. Or reading something awful that has happened to a child on the other side of the planet. Or by somebody zooming past us in a sports car, and we decide that we're now economically inadequate, and you never even see the person's face. Or reading something that happened to a character in a novel. We can feel this and nobody else does. On the flip side, we feel compassion, empathy, for a friend. Or someone in a refugee camp. Or a member of another species. It's the same boring physiology as every other animal out there, and we're using it in a way that is unrecognizable. 3. When we're doing something that no other animal has anything similar to. E.g., a couple talks, have sex, sleep. They do that for 30 days running. Hippos would be repulsed by this. Because anybody in the animal kingdom has non-reproductive sex. Also, nobody else out there talks about it afterward. It's only human behavior. Language. Sexuality. That's what we're gonna do on this course. We will resist categorical thinking. Because you can fall into categorical thinking, and you can do unspeakable damage in a realm of science. We will do so, thinking constantly about ourselves as a boring species just like all the others out there. As a species that has the same boring physiology, but uses it in ways that are unrecognizable. As a species that does some things that are simply without precedent out there. And constantly struggling with what does biology have to do with it? The course is going to be an overview, introduction to the various buckets, categories. Introduction to evolutionary theory. Molecular genetics has to do with behavior. Behavioral genetics. Ethology. Brain. Endocrinology. Then, specific behaviors, and in each case, rip apart the buckets. What does the behavior look like? What happened a second before? Neurons. Sensory stimuli that trigger those neurons. All the way back to the evolutionary selective pressures. Individual categories of behavior. Sexual behavior, aggressive, parental. Schizophrenia, depression, personality disorders, language use. What's going on 2 seconds before, or 10 million years before? Where do all these buckets disappear in the interactions? The course got no prerequisites. This is a subject that everybody on Earth should be forced to learn about it. The whole point is to be able to do this even if you don't have a science background. Because everybody has to learn behavioral biology. Because we're being behavioral biologists every time we serve on a jury. Every time we vote. Whether money should be spent on solving some problem. Every time we try to make sense of a family member sunk in depression. Are they having a biochemical disorder? Or are they just indulging themselves? Books, Chaos by James Gleick. One of his books, but he didn't mention which one. Keeps talking of how he will evaluate the course.